She pressed both hands flat against her swollen belly and screamed his name into the empty air, but Caleb Whitmore never turned around. He kept walking, straight through the crowd, straight past the ticket booth, straight out of her life, and every single person standing on that platform watched it happen. None of them moved, not one of them spoke, they just stared at the fat, pregnant woman gasping in the Kansas heat and looked away. If you've ever been left behind by someone who swore they'd stay, this story is for you. Subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and drop the name of your city in the comments below because I want to see just how far this story travels. Stay with me all the way to the end. What happens next will stay with you long after the last word. The summer of 1884 had no mercy. It came down on Red Willow, Kansas like something personal, dry, and relentless, pressing itself against every living thing until even the grass gave up and turned the color of old bone. The sky was a flat, scorched white from before dawn until long after sunset, and the air tasted like iron and dust no matter which direction the wind came from. Evelyn Marlowe had been sitting on that platform bench for 6 hours. She knew the exact number because she had counted every church bell that rang from the little white chapel 3 blocks east of the station, the one she'd spotted from the train window when they'd pulled into Red Willow just after 8 that morning. She'd thought it was pretty then. She'd thought a lot of things were pretty that morning, when she'd still believed the man sitting beside her was going to keep his word. The bench was wooden and warped, and it bit into the backs of her thighs through the thin cotton of her dress. Her feet had swollen inside her boots sometime around noon. She hadn't tried to remove them. There was nowhere to go. Her suitcase sat beside her right foot, a brown leather case, the latch held shut with a piece of twine, because the metal clasp had broken 3 years ago and she'd never had the money to fix it. Inside it were 2 dresses, a set of undergarments, a hairbrush with a cracked handle, a small tin photograph of her mother taken in 1867, and $41 in coins and small bills that she'd been saving for 2 years, stitch by stitch, from the sewing work she'd done out of her sister's house in Philadelphia. $41. She'd thought it was enough to start over. She'd thought a lot of things. Evelyn was 39 years old and large, in the way that made strangers feel entitled to comment, broad through the shoulders, heavy through the middle, her face round and soft above the high collar of her dress. She had dark brown hair that curled at the temples when the humidity climbed, and gray had started threading through it these last 2 years, fine silver lines she'd stopped trying to hide. Her hands were her best feature. She'd always thought wide-palmed and capable, the knuckles slightly rough from years of needlework, shaped like her father's hands, which he had always said meant she was built for real work. She had done real work her whole life. It hadn't kept her from ending up here. She placed her hands on top of her belly 7 months along, round and firm and undeniable, and she breathed slowly through her nose the way the midwife back in Philadelphia had shown her. In through the nose, hold out through the mouth, slow. Steady, don't let the fear swallow you whole. It was almost swallowing her whole. The platform had been busy earlier, families loading onto the eastbound train. A group of young men heading west with the eager, half-scared energy of people who still believed distance solved problems. 2 women in smart traveling clothes who had looked at Evelyn for exactly 2 seconds, too long, before steering themselves deliberately to the far end of the platform. A station master who'd asked her twice if she was waiting for someone, and then stopped asking, which was worse. Now most everyone had gone. There were 3 men near the far wall, talking about cattle prices. A boy of about 12 sitting on an overturned crate, drawing something in the dirt with a stick. A woman in a yellow dress crossing the street below the platform steps, not looking up. None of them were Caleb Whitmore. He had been gone since 10:30. They had stepped off the train together, or she had believed they'd stepped off together. She had been slow, careful on the iron steps, because her balance had shifted in the last weeks, her center of gravity rearranged by the weight of the child, and she'd had to take the handrail and go 1 step at a time. When she reached the platform, she'd looked up and Caleb was already 20 feet away, moving fast, his back straight and his hat down low. She'd called his name. He'd slowed just slightly. Turned his head but not his body. "I need to speak to someone," he'd said. "Wait here," and she'd waited. At 10:55 she started to understand. By 11:30 she knew he wasn't coming back. She sat with that knowledge the way you sit with news of a death. The first hour is almost calm, almost quiet, because the mind refuses to take the whole weight of it at once. She had thought, he'll come around the corner any moment. She had thought, he must have run into someone he knows, gotten held up. She had thought, there's an explanation. There's always an explanation. There wasn't an explanation. There was just Caleb Whitmore, who had spent 6 weeks in Philadelphia telling her she was the most remarkable woman he'd ever known, who had sat across her sister's kitchen table and looked at her with his pale blue eyes and said he'd never met anyone with her kind of quiet strength, who had told her he had a piece of land in the Colorado Territory, 50 acres with water rights and a good-sized house and more space than one man needed, and that he wanted to share it with a woman who had real substance to her, real heart. She'd been cautious. Lord knows she'd been cautious. She was 39 years old, and she had not arrived at 39 without learning a few things about how men talked versus how men behaved. She'd watched 3 of her friends marry men who talked beautifully for 6 months and then became strangers by the 2nd year. She had sworn to herself she would not be careless with what little she had left. But Caleb had been patient. He'd courted her for 2 months. He'd met her sister. He'd been polite and steady, and then one evening in April, sitting on her sister's porch while the fireflies came out over the garden, he'd taken her hand and told her he loved her and asked if she'd come west with him. She hadn't known she was already carrying his child then. When she found out, 4 weeks later, she'd told him expecting the worst. He'd smiled. He'd told her children were exactly what a man needed to make a house a home. He'd told her this was the best news he could have gotten. She'd believed him. She had packed everything she owned into one suitcase with a broken clasp, and she had gotten on a train to Kansas, and she had trusted him. Evelyn pressed her eyes shut and breathed, in through the nose. Hold. Out through the mouth. Behind her eyelids she could see her sister Margaret's face. When she'd said goodbye, the careful, controlled expression of a woman trying not to say what she was actually thinking. Margaret hadn't liked Caleb. She'd said it once, plainly, and Evelyn had said she understood Margaret's concern, and that she was old enough to make her own choices, and Margaret had pressed her lips together and helped her pack anyway, because that was what sisters did. Evelyn thought, I have to call Margaret. I have to find a telegraph office and send a message and tell her what? That Margaret had been right? That the man was gone? That she was sitting on a platform in a town she'd never heard of before yesterday with $41 and a baby coming and no plan in the world. She thought she might be sick. She breathed. She held the sides of her belly with both hands, and she said, very quietly, almost under her breath so no one could hear, "We're all right." I promise, we're going to be all right. She did not know if that was true. She said it anyway, because someone needed to say it, and she was the only one there. The shadows were going long when the supply wagon came around the north side of the station. She heard it before she saw it, the heavy creak of wagon wheels, the blow of a horse, the particular sound of a loaded rig moving at a measured pace. Then it came around the corner of the building and stopped at the hitching post at the near end of the platform, and the man driving it wrapped the reins around the post and stepped down. He was tall, not dramatically tall, but the kind of tall that was simply part of how a man was built, like it had never occurred to him to be any other way. 40, maybe 42, broad in the shoulders and narrow through the face, with the deep tan of a man who worked outdoors in every season, and a jaw that was set slightly, the way jaws got set when thinking was happening behind it. He wore a plain work shirt, dark from the heat, and canvas trousers and boots that had seen serious use. His hat was the color of old straw, and he wore it pulled low enough that she couldn't see the upper half of his face until he walked up the steps onto the platform. He was carrying a list on a folded piece of paper, which he opened and read as he walked toward the station door. He stopped when he was about 12 feet from her bench. He didn't stare. He glanced one quick, taking stock look the way a man does when he's trying to understand a situation without being rude about the looking. She'd been looked at all day. She knew the difference between a look that catalogued her size and her condition and her aloneness and filed her away as someone else's problem, and a look that was actually seeing her. His was the second kind. He folded his list and put it in his shirt pocket. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was low and flat, western-edged, the kind of voice that didn't rise at the end of sentences. "Sir," she answered. Her own voice came out steadier than she expected. He looked at the bench, at her suitcase, at the empty platform around her. Not in a rude way, in the way of a man assembling information. "You waiting on someone?" he asked. She had been asked that question twice today, and both times she'd said yes because saying no required an explanation she didn't have the energy for. But there was something in the directness of this man's asking, not nosy, not intrusive, just honest, that made her answer the same way. "No," she said, "not anymore." He stood there for a moment. Most men hearing that would have nodded and moved on. The situation was not his business and not his problem, and the polite thing to do, the easy thing, was to go inside and collect whatever he'd come for and drive back to wherever he'd come from. He didn't move. "Platform closes at sundown," he said. "Station master locks up." "I know," she said. "You got somewhere to go?" She looked at him. He wasn't asking it the way people asked questions they already knew the answer to and were just making talk. He was asking it because the answer mattered to whatever he was going to do next. "Not at the moment," she said. He took his hat off, which surprised her. He held it at his side. There was a line across his forehead where the hat had been, pale skin above and tan below, and his hair was dark brown shot through with gray. "My name's Nathaniel Calloway," he said. "I run a cattle ranch up in the Colorado Territory. 40 miles north and a half days ride west. I come down here every few weeks for supplies." She looked at him. "Evelyn Marlowe, Miss Marlowe." He paused. "Or Mrs.?" He nodded once, no judgment in it. "How long you been sitting here?" "Since 10:30 this morning." Something moved through his expression, not pity, which she couldn't have stood, but something harder than that. Something that had an opinion about it, without saying the opinion out loud. "You eat today?" he asked. The question was so practical and so unexpected that for a moment she didn't know what to do with it. "No," she said. "I know." He put his hat back on. "There's a decent enough place 2 streets over," he said. "I was heading there myself before I collect my supplies." "You'd be welcome to come." She looked at him. She had learned bitterly recently, and at significant cost, not to take offers from men at face value. She had learned that offers came wrapped around expectations. That kindness was frequently a currency men spent expecting change back. "Why?" she asked. She kept her voice level. "Why would you do that?" He didn't flinch from the question. He seemed to have expected it. "Because you've been sitting in the heat all day, without food," he said. "And because a woman in your condition," he glanced briefly at her middle. Not with embarrassment, but with the matter-of-fact recognition of someone who'd spent his life around the realities of bodies and birth and weather, shouldn't be doing that. That's all," she repeated. "That's all," he said. "I'm not asking anything of you, Miss Marlowe. I'm offering a meal." "You can say no." She looked at the platform around her. She looked at the long shadow of the station building, stretching east. She looked at the town she didn't know, in the county she didn't know, in the state she'd only passed through on a train headed somewhere she wasn't going to get to now. She stood up. She was slower than she'd been 3 months ago, and she hated the way her body made every movement a negotiation now. She got herself upright and reached for her suitcase, and he was there, not grabbing for it, not making a production of it, just picking it up as naturally as you'd pick up your own bag. "I can carry that," she said. "I know you can," he said. "I've got 2 free hands and you've got enough to manage." He said it the way you'd say something that was simply true, not a commentary on her limitations. He looked at her, waiting. She let him carry it. They walked 2 streets over, and he held the door to the eating house open for her without making a scene about it, and the woman, behind the counter, looked at Evelyn the way strangers had been looking at her all day, that quick calculating assessment that took in her size and her obvious pregnancy and her lack of companion and formed a conclusion. But Nathaniel simply said, 2 plates, whatever's hot, and coffee, and sat down across from Evelyn as if the seating arrangement were the most natural thing in the world. The food came, beans and salt pork and cornbread and black coffee that was too strong but hot. She ate. She hadn't understood until the food was in front of her how hungry she was, how her hands were shaking, how much of her steadiness on the platform had been sheer stubbornness running on empty. She ate carefully because dignity still mattered, but she ate. He ate too. He didn't make conversation for conversation's sake. He wasn't performing consideration. He wasn't leaning forward and looking at her with arranged sympathy the way people did when they wanted you to know they were being kind. He just ate and drank his coffee and let the meal be a meal. After a while she said, "You didn't ask what happened." "No," he agreed. "Most people would have. I reckon it's not my business unless you want it to be." She was quiet for a moment. "A man brought me here," she said. "From Philadelphia. He had a piece of land in Colorado, and he told me he said he wanted." She stopped. "Started again. He left this morning, once we got off the train." Nathaniel didn't say anything. He set his coffee cup down. "He knew about the baby," she said. "He said it didn't matter. He said he wanted." She pressed her lips together. She was not going to cry at this table. She had cried once today, alone on the bench when no one was close enough to see, and that had been enough. "It seems he changed his mind. He left you on the platform," Nathaniel said. "Yes, this morning." He looked at his coffee. His jaw had done that setting thing again, tight, controlled, the surface stillness of a man keeping something contained. "I'm sorry," he said, and he said it the way people who have actually felt sorry said it, without adornment, without making it about themselves, just placing the words down, like something real. She nodded. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for a moment, and then put her hand down. "I have money," she said. $41. I'm not asking you for anything. I needed to eat, and I appreciate it. And I'll pay you back for the meal." "You won't," he said. "Miss Marlowe." His voice was quiet but absolute. "You will not pay me back for a plate of beans. That is not something I'm willing to debate." She looked at him. "What I am willing to talk about," he said, "if you're willing to hear it, is a practical situation." She waited. He folded his hands on the table. They were large hands, calloused and capable, the kind of hands that knew how to do real things. "I've got a ranch house with a spare room," he said. "Solid roof, wood-burning stove, water from a good well. I live alone. Been alone for a good while. There's work that needs doing around the place, mending. Some cooking when I'm out on the range and can't get back to it in time. General keeping of the house." "I'm not offering charity." He said the word like it tasted wrong. "I'm offering a situation that could work for both parties, if you're of a mind." She stared at him. "You don't know me." "That's true. I walked off a train platform an hour ago. You know nothing about me. I know you've been sitting in the heat all day and didn't ask a single person for help," he said. "I know you answered my question straight, even when a sideways answer would have been easier. And I know you're carrying a child, and you've got $41 and no destination." He looked at her evenly. "That's enough to know." "Why?" she said again, the same question. She needed to understand it. "Why would a man who doesn't know me, why would you do this?" He was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee cup once, a small rotation. Then he said, "I know what it is to be alone when you shouldn't have to be. That's all." He looked up at her. "I'm not asking you to trust me completely. I'm asking you to consider whether staying on a platform till morning is a better option." The eating house was mostly empty now. Through the window she could see the last of the daylight going orange above the roof lines. She thought about the platform. She thought about $41 and no destination, a baby coming in 2 months, and a world that it spent today, reminding her exactly what it thought of women like her. She thought about the way he'd carried her suitcase without making a speech about it. "If I come," she said slowly, "and I don't like what I find there, if anything about it is wrong, I leave. Immediately." "Agreed," he said. "And I'm not beholden to you," she said. Not for the meal. Not for the room. I'll work for my keep and we settle it like that, and I don't owe you beyond what we agree." "Agreed," he said again, and he said it like a man who kept his agreements. "And you'll tell me everything about the arrangement before we get there," she said. "No surprises. I'll tell you whatever you want to know," he said. She sat with it for a moment more. Then she said, "All right, Mr. Calloway." He nodded. He didn't smile like he'd won something. He just nodded, like they'd settled a reasonable piece of business. The wagon ride north took until well after dark. He'd collected his supplies: flour, lamp oil, nails, salt, coffee, a particular kind of bolt he'd had ordered from back east, and loaded the wagon with the systematic efficiency of a man who did this regularly. He'd helped her up to the wagon bench the same way he'd carried her suitcase, matter-of-factly, offering an arm without commentary. She sat beside him in the dark as the wagon rolled out of Red Willow, and the lights of the town fell away behind them, and the Kansas plains opened up on all sides under a sky that was absolutely thick with stars. She had not seen a sky like that since she was a child, visiting her grandmother's farm in Ohio. The cities ate the stars. Out here there was nothing to eat them. She watched them and thought about everything she'd left in Philadelphia. Margaret's kitchen, the smell of her sister's coffee, the particular squeak of the second stair from the top of the landing, the familiar weight of her chair by the window where she did her best needlework in the afternoon light. "You said you've been alone a good while," she said, after a while. 11 years, he said. What happened? He kept his eyes on the road. "My wife died," he said. "Fever fast. Our boy was 4 years old." She turned to look at him. "I'm sorry. Thank you." "Your boy, he's not at the ranch?" "He's in Denver," Nathaniel said. "Living with my sister and her husband. Getting a proper schooling. He's 15 now. Comes out summers when he can." He paused. "His name's James. That's a good name," she said. "It was my father's name." They were quiet again. The horse moved steadily. The wagon wheels found their rhythm over the packed dirt road. "People are going to talk," she said, "about me being there." "A woman alone at your ranch. People talk," he said simply. "It doesn't bother you?" He glanced at her, one quick look. "People talked when Ellen died," he said. "Said I should have been with her instead of out on the range. Said I should have called a doctor sooner. Said all kinds of things." He turned back to the road. "Talking doesn't make things true, and worrying about it doesn't make anything better." She considered that. "You're a practical man," she said. "I try to be." Was that practical today, stopping at the platform? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Maybe not entirely." She almost smiled. She didn't. She was too tired for smiling, but she almost did. They reached the Colorado Territory border as the moon came up, and somewhere in the next hour she felt herself sway with tiredness and caught herself against the side of the wagon. Without a word he reached to the back and pulled out a rolled blanket and handed it to her, and she leaned against the footboard and slept. She dreamed of her mother's kitchen, of bread baking, of the feeling of being in a place where she was expected, where her presence was not a problem to be managed, but simply a part of how the place worked. She hadn't had that feeling in a long time. When she woke, the wagon had stopped. The sky had gone from black to the deep blue that comes just before first light. The stars were fading at the horizon. She could smell water, a real smell, a creek or a river close by, not the flat iron smell of the empty plains. "We're here," Nathaniel said. She sat up and looked. The house was low and long, built from squared timber that had gone silvery gray with age. There was a porch along the front, deep enough to be useful, with 2 plain chairs on it. A barn further back, big, well-built, fencing she could see even in the pre-dawn dark running out in both directions. The land beyond it was all shadows and the suggestion of a valley dropping away to the east. It was not pretty in the way of picture postcards. It was real, solid. "It's a good house," she said, without meaning to say it out loud. "It does the job," he said. He helped her down from the wagon and carried her suitcase to the door, and he lit a lamp inside and showed her the spare room's small clean, with a rope bed and a quilt and a window that faced east. There was a chest of drawers and a hook on the back of the door and enough space to move around comfortably. "The kitchen's there," he said from the hallway. "Wood stacked by the back door. Water's out at the well. I'll show you the pump tomorrow so you know how it works." He paused. "You need anything tonight?" She stood in the middle of the small room with her hand resting on her belly, looking around at the clean walls and the folded quilt and the east-facing window. "No," she said. "Thank you. I'm all right. Sleep as long as you need," he said. "Nothing needs doing before you're ready. Mr. Calloway." He stopped in the doorway. "What you did today," she hesitated. She had been raised to be precise with words, to mean what she said and say what she meant. Most people would not have stopped. He considered this. Most people got other things on their minds, he said. Didn't? He looked at her for a moment, his hand on the doorframe, the lamplight making everything in the hall warm and shadow-edged. "I had a supply list," he said. "I still got my supplies." So it worked out, and he turned and went down the hall. She stood alone in the spare room, listening to the sounds of the house settling around her, the small sounds of a place that was used to being quiet, that had its own rhythms, and she held her belly and breathed. She had made a mistake in Caleb Whitmore. She had trusted the wrong man. She had given him her faith and her future, and he had shown her exactly what he thought that faith was worth. She was not going to make the same mistake again. Whatever this was, this room, this ranch, this quiet obligist, and his 11 years alone, she would not be careless with it. She would earn her place here fairly, and she would guard herself carefully, and she would not confuse kindness for something it might not be. But she would sleep tonight. She would sleep in a bed with a quilt and a window, with a roof that wasn't leaking and walls that weren't the open sky, and tomorrow she would figure out what came next. She sat on the edge of the bed and pulled off her boots. The relief of it made her exhale aloud, a long, slow breath, and she lay down on top of the quilt without undressing, because she was too tired to do anything else. And she pulled one corner of the quilt over herself. The baby moved, a small, insistent press against the inside of her belly, like a hand flat against a door. "I know," she whispered. "I know. We're here. We're all right." She was asleep in 4 minutes. Outside in the barn, Nathaniel Calloway unsaddled the wagon horse and watered it and threw down fresh hay, moving in the dark the way a man moves when he knows a space so well he doesn't need light for it. He worked slowly, methodically, the way he did everything. When he was done, he stood in the opened barn door for a while, looking at the house. One window was lit, the spare room, the lamp she hadn't yet blown out. He could see the shadow of it against the curtain, faint and still. He thought about the platform, about the way she'd sat straight-backed on that bench in the heat, not asking anyone for anything, not performing her distress for the crowd. About the way she'd looked at him when she'd asked why, not suspicious exactly, but honest about the asking, the way someone was honest when they'd been burned before and had learned not to take surface appearances at face value. He thought about Caleb Whitmore, whoever he was, walking off that platform. He pressed his jaw together and turned back into the barn. There were things in this world a man couldn't do much about. There were things he could. He'd done what he could. He blew out the barn lamp and walked back toward the house, and the stars overhead were already beginning to fade at the eastern edge, and somewhere down in the valley a meadowlark called out once into the dark. Early and hopeful, the way meadowlarks always were. The spare room window went dark. He went inside. She woke to the smell of coffee. Not the weak, watered-down kind she'd grown used to in the boarding houses she'd passed through over the last month's real coffee, dark and serious, the kind that meant someone had put thought into it. The smell came under the door of the spare room and pulled her up from the deepest sleep she'd had in weeks, maybe months, the kind of sleep that left you feeling scraped clean and slightly disoriented. Like you'd been set down somewhere unfamiliar and had to remember all over again where you were. She remembered Colorado Territory, a ranch 40 miles north of Red Willow. A man named Nathaniel Calloway who had picked up her suitcase without being asked. She lay still for a moment, her hands on her belly, listening to the house. There were sounds she hadn't heard in years, the quiet knock of a wood stove being loaded, The particular creak of floorboards under a steady, unhurried walk, the distant low sound of cattle somewhere outside. Real sounds. The sounds of a place that was alive and functional and had no interest in impressing anyone. She got herself up. She was slower in the mornings, now her body required negotiation before it would cooperate, and she took the time to smooth her dress as well as she could and pin her hair back properly, because whatever else was uncertain, she was going to present herself like a woman who had not given up on herself. She looked in the small mirror above the chest of drawers. Her face was puffy from the heat of yesterday and the long cry she'd had alone on the platform bench and the deep sleep after, and there were shadows under her eyes, but her eyes themselves were clear. She had her mother's eyes, dark brown, steady. Her mother had looked at hard things with those eyes and hadn't looked away. Evelyn intended to do the same. She opened the door and went to find the kitchen. Nathaniel was at the stove. He'd already been outside, his boots were dusty, and he turned when he heard her in the doorway, not startled, just alert, the way a man was alert who was used to living alone and tracking every sound in his house automatically. "Morning," he said. "Good morning." She looked around the kitchen. It was a working kitchen, no prettiness to it, no attempts at decoration, just function. A heavy iron stove, a long pine table with 4 chairs, shelves with supplies arranged with the systematic logic of a person who knew what they had and where they'd put it. Clean, not spotless in the way of someone who cleaned obsessively, but the clean of a person who kept things because letting them go to ruin was wasteful. "Coffee's ready," he said. "There's eggs if you want them." "I can make the eggs," she said. He glanced at her. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," she said. "I want to. Tell me where things are," he told her. He was straightforward about it, no hovering, no explaining things she hadn't asked to have explained. The eggs were in a clay bowl on the second shelf. The pan was hanging on the left hook. Salt was in the tin by the stove. She moved around the kitchen slowly, finding her way into its logic, and he poured 2 cups of coffee and sat at the table and didn't make a production of watching her or not watching her. He just sat. She scrambled the eggs with a fork the way her mother had done it, working them gently in the pan so they came out soft, not rubbery, and she divided them onto 2 plates and brought them to the table and sat down. They ate. "How long have you had the ranch?" she asked. 14 years, he said. Came out in 1870. Bought the land from a man who'd broken his leg in 2 places the winter before and decided he'd had enough of Colorado. He drank his coffee. Built the barn first, then the house. Took 3 years to get the herd to where it made sense. "Where did you come from originally?" "Ohio," he said. She looked up at him. "I have family in Ohio. My grandmother's farm was in Wayne County." Something shifted in his face, not surprise exactly, more like the slight ease a person felt when they found unexpected common ground. "I grew up outside Cossocton," he said. "My father had a mill." "A long way from a mill to a cattle ranch," she said. Seemed like the right direction at the time. He paused. It still does. She thought about that. About the particular courage it took to move toward something that was only an idea of a thing, not a certainty. She had tried to do that herself, and it had collapsed. But she understood the impulse. She had always understood the impulse. "The work you mentioned," she said. "The mending and the cooking when you're out on the range. Tell me what you actually need." He put his cup down. "I've got a hand, Tom Bright, comes in 4 days a week for the heavy range work. He doesn't stay on the property. It's mostly just me here, and when I'm out for long days or overnight runs, I come back to whatever state the house is in, which is usually not good." He said this without self-pity, just inventory. "I've got shirts that need mending, going back 6 months. Blankets. Some curtains in here that Ellen made before she died, I'd like them repaired if it's possible." He said his wife's name without flinching, but Evelyn caught the slight pause before it, the small bracing a person did when they said the name of someone gone. "Possible," she said. "Bread," he said. "I can cook a hot meal well enough, but I can't bake worth a damn." "Whatever you're comfortable with." "I can bake," she said. "My sister taught me. She's the better cook between us, but I'm adequate." She considered. I'll need to know what supplies you have and what you're short on. I can write you a list, or you can show me the shelves and I'll make my own assessment." He looked at her for a moment. "All right," he said. She helped him clear the plates, which he accepted without argument, and he showed her the pantry shelves and the root cellar access and the garden plot out back, which had gone somewhat wild. He'd planted it in the spring, and then gotten too busy with a difficult calving season to keep it properly. She walked through it slowly, noting what had survived the neglect and what hadn't. Tomato plants, tough and straggly but still producing. Onions, some squash that had done its own thing out along the fence. Herbs that had gone to seed but still held their smell. "You've got more here than you think," she said. "You're welcome to whatever you can use from it." He watched her moving through the garden, not with the hovering anxiety she'd expected from a man worried she'd overextend herself, but with the considering look of a person reassessing an assumption. "You know your way around a garden." "My grandmother's farm," she said. "I spent every summer there until I was 16. She touched the top of a tomato plant, feeling the health of the stem. "You should stake these higher. They're falling over their own weight." "I'll put that on the list," he said, and there was something almost dry in it, not a joke exactly, but the dry acknowledgement of a man who had a very long list already. She almost smiled, again. She had almost smiled twice now in less than 12 hours. That felt significant, though she couldn't have said why. The first days at the Callaway Ranch had a rhythm that established itself with surprising ease, and that ease was itself suspicious to her, in the way that anything pleasant and unexpected made her look for the thing underneath it. She had learned that lesson in the most brutal possible way, and she was not going to unlearn it just because the coffee was good and the man was quiet. She set up her sewing in the front room, by the east window, where the morning light came in best. Nathaniel brought her the pile of mending shirts, 3 pairs of canvas trousers, 2 wool blankets with fraying edges, and the curtains, which were a faded blue cotton with a small white pattern. Beautifully made. The kind of stitching that had required real patience and skill. She held one of the curtains up and examined the seams. Whoever Ellen Callaway had been, she'd known what she was doing with a needle. Nathaniel came in to put a log on the fire and saw her with the curtain. He stopped. "I can repair these," she said. "They're well made. The fabric's still sound where it matters. I'll need to source a bit of matching material for the worst of the tiers, but I can work around most of it." He was looking at the curtain in her hands. He had an expression she hadn't seen on him, yet carefully neutral, in the specific way of someone keeping something private. "She made those in the 2nd year we were here," he said. "Ordered the fabric from a catalog. Took her most of that winter." "They're worth saving," Evelyn said. She kept her voice level, practical. "I'll save them if I can." He nodded. Once he put the log on the fire and went back outside. She set the curtain down in her lap and sat with it for a moment. Then she threaded her needle and began. Tom Bright arrived on the 4th morning, a wiry man of about 50, with a sun-creased face and the particular manner of a working man who'd spent so many years on someone else's land that he'd developed a system of precise, polite neutrality toward everyone who wasn't a horse. He acknowledged Evelyn with a nod and a ma'am and went about his business, and that was the extent of it, until the 2nd week. When he came in for water at midday, and she had bread fresh from the oven, and she offered him a slice without making a ceremony of it. He ate it standing up. "That's the first decent bread bin in this house in 11 years, he said. "Mr. Callaway told me he couldn't bake," she said. "That's generous," Tom said. "What he makes would stop a horse." He took his water and went back out, and that was the first time Evelyn laughed, really laughed, not just almost smiled, since before she'd gotten on that train. It startled her. The sound of her own laugh, in that kitchen, startled her, like hearing music coming from a room you'd assumed was empty. She stood at the kitchen counter, listening to the echo of it. She pressed her lips together, but she didn't try to take it back. The town was the harder thing. She'd known it would be. You couldn't be a pregnant, unmarried woman of 39 in a frontier community in 1884 and expect anything different, and she had no illusions about it. But knowing a thing in the abstract and then living inside it were different experiences entirely. The first time Nathaniel took her into the nearest settlement, a small town called Harker's Creek, 18 miles south, she felt it the moment she stepped down from the wagon. The way the space on the sidewalk rearranged itself. The way women who were standing in conversation let their voices drop and their eyes sharpen. A man in front of the dry goods store watched her cross the street with an expression that was frankly contemptuous. No effort to conceal it, the way people didn't bother concealing things they thought everyone agreed on. She kept her spine straight and her face forward, and she walked into the dry goods store behind Nathaniel, and she did not give anyone the satisfaction of seeing that she'd noticed. Inside, the woman behind the counter, Mrs. Aldrich, her name turned out to be a bird-boned woman in her 50s with silver hair and watchful eyes, gave Evelyn the full assessment over Nathaniel's shoulder while he put in his order. "New to the area?" Mrs. Aldrich asked. She was addressing Nathaniel but looking at Evelyn. "Helping out at the ranch," Nathaniel said. His voice was easy, matter-of-fact. Not defensive, not apologetic. Just a statement of fact delivered like a statement of fact. Mrs. Aldrich shifted her gaze to Evelyn. "And you are?" "Evelyn Marlowe," Evelyn said. "Where are you from, Miss Marlowe?" "Philadelphia, originally." Something moved through Mrs. Aldrich's face. "Long way to come," she said, "and she said it the way you said something when what you meant was entirely different from the words you were using." "It is," Evelyn agreed, pleasantly. She held the woman's gaze, without flinching and without warmth, just held it, steady and direct, until Mrs. Aldrich was the one who looked away. Nathaniel said nothing. But when they walked out of the store 15 minutes later with his supplies, he said, quietly and without looking at her, "You handled that well." "I've had practice," she said. "I imagine you have." They loaded the wagon in silence, and then he said, "There'll be more of it. I want you to know I'm aware of that. And I want you to know it's not something I consider your fault or your problem to manage alone." She looked at him across the wagon bed. "What do you mean?" "I mean, if someone speaks to you in a way that's unkind, you tell me," he said. "And I'll speak to them. I can defend myself, Mr. Calloway." "I know that," he said. "You've been defending yourself your whole life by the look of it. I'm saying you don't have to do it alone anymore." He picked up a flour sack and settled it in the wagon. "That's all." She stood there for a moment, holding a paper package of salt, looking at him. She had not had anyone say something like that to her in a very long time. Maybe ever. Even Margaret, who loved her, had always approached Evelyn's difficulties with the slight implication that Evelyn could have navigated them better if she'd made different choices. The message underneath the support was always, "You brought some of this on yourself." Nathaniel wasn't saying that. He was saying, "You don't have to do it alone." With no qualifier under it, she put the salt in the wagon. "Thank you," she said carefully. He nodded and went around to check the horse's harness and said nothing more about it. That night she sat up later than usual in the front room, her sewing in her lap, the fire low, listening to the particular silence of the ranch at night, different from the silence of Philadelphia, which was never really silence. Always underlaid with the noise of people and horses and the constant pressure of the city. This silence had texture, wind in the grass, the occasional sound from the barn. The creak of the house in the dark. She was halfway through the second of the curtains, the worst damaged one, and she was working carefully by the lamplight on a section of torn seam that required tiny, precise stitches to hold without showing. She was so absorbed in it that she didn't hear Nathaniel come into the doorway. "You should sleep," he said. She startled not dramatically, just a small catch of breath, and looked up. He was in the doorway in his work clothes, without his hat, and he looked tired in the way of a man who'd been working since before dawn. "I'm almost done with this section," she said. "I want to finish it while I have the light on." He came into the room and sat in the other chair, the plain one by the window, and she thought he was going to say something more about sleeping, but he didn't. He just sat. He pulled a piece of harness from beside the chair he'd apparently left it there earlier for repair and began working on it with a small leather tool, and they sat in companionable silence, each working on their separate thing. She had not sat in comfortable silence with another person, and she thought about it, and she couldn't remember when. She finished her section and knotted the thread and cut it, and looked at the seam. Clean, invisible almost, if you knew what you were looking for. "Your wife was a good seamstress," she said. He didn't look up from the harness. "She was good at most things she put her mind to," he said. "You miss her." It wasn't a question, she hadn't meant it as one. He was quiet for a moment. "Every day," he said, "differently than I used to. It doesn't knock the breath out of me anymore, but it's there." She looked at the curtain in her hands. "I'm sorry," she said. "About what I said, I didn't mean to." "You didn't say anything wrong," he said. "I like talking about her. People don't, mostly. They get careful around it, like it'll make things worse." He looked up from the harness then, and looked at her directly. "Does that ever happen to you? People getting careful around things that are just true?" She held his gaze. "Constantly," she said. He nodded like she'd confirmed something he'd already suspected. "People mean well," he said. Mostly, she agreed. They went back to their work, but something had shifted, slightly, in the quality of the air between them. Not anything she could have named to someone else, not anything she would have even tried to name to herself yet. Just a shift. The difference between two people existing in the same space and two people actually being somewhere together. She noticed it, and she filed it away carefully, and she did not examine it further that night. The next morning brought trouble. It started small, the way trouble often started, with a sound that was slightly wrong. She was at the kitchen stove when she heard it, a rider coming in fast from the east road, faster than anyone came to a working ranch unless something was wrong. She went to the window. It was Tom Bright, and he was riding like something was chasing him. She went to the back door. "Mr. Calloway," she called, and he was already coming out of the barn at a run because he'd heard it too. Tom pulled the horse up short in the yard. He was breathing hard. "Got a problem down at the south fence," he said. "Two men from the Harker place been cutting wire along the east property line. Third fence section in a week." Nathaniel's face went still and flat in the way she'd come to recognize the particular stillness of a man who was angry in a controlled way, the stillness that was harder to face than shouting. "How much?" 40 feet cut clean through and folded back. "Cattle from their herd were already through the gap when I found it." "How many head?" 8, 9, mixed in with yours along the creek bottom." Nathaniel turned and went back into the barn without another word. She heard him saddling up the quick, efficient sounds of a man who'd done it 1,000 times and could do it in the dark. Tom walked his horse around to the water trough. Evelyn brought Tom a cup of coffee from the stove because he looked like he needed it, and he took it with a nod. "Does this happen often?" she asked. Tom drank the coffee and looked at her with the measuring expression she was starting to recognize as his version of openness. "Dalton Harker's been pushing on Nate's fences for 2 years, he said. Wants the creek water rights. Can't get them legal, so he chips away at the line." "Mr. Calloway hasn't done anything about it?" "He's handled it," Tom said. "Legal, proper, filed every complaint, but the county seat's 60 miles off, and the marshal's a man, 6 based on who he likes better, and Harker's got more money." He drank the last of the coffee and handed the cup back. "Nate don't lose his temper easy, but I've known him 14 years, and this," he looked toward the barn, "this is wearing on him." Nathaniel came out of the barn on the gray horse, moving fast. He looked at Evelyn once, briefly. "I'll be back by midday," he said. "Lock the front gate if you go out." "Is it dangerous?" she asked. He held her gaze for 1 second. "Not for you," he said. And he rode. She stood in the yard after he was gone, listening to the fading hoofbeats, and she thought about a man who'd been alone for 11 years, fighting a 2-year boundary war by himself, handling it legal and proper while the other side kept cutting his wire, and coming home to an empty house every night to deal with whatever the day had left on him. She went inside. She had bread dough rising since before dawn. She shaped it and put it in the oven and started on dinner. And then she went to the front room and picked up Nathaniel's shirts from the mending pile, the 3 that needed the most work. the collars fraying and one with a long split seam along the side, and she set to work on those. She worked steadily, and she did not let herself think too much about Caleb Whitmore. But she did think about him, the way you thought about a wound, not continuously, but in sudden sharp pulses that were almost physical in their force. She thought about how he'd looked at her, in her sister's garden. She thought about how she'd believed him. She thought about the look on his face on the platform, not guilt. She remembered now with the clarity of distance, not shame. Just the flat, faintly irritated look of a man removing a complication. That was what she had been to him, a complication. She pushed the needle through the collar seam and pulled it through and thought, I am not a complication. I am a person. I have always been a person and no one who needed to be told that was worth trusting with my life. She pulled the thread through again, tight, even. Whatever she was building here, whatever this was, she was going to build it on something real. On work honestly done and fair terms kept and no pretending. That was what she knew how to do. That was what she had. Nathaniel came back at noon as he'd said. He came through the door, and she could read the set of his jaw before he even took his hat off. It had gone slightly further forward, pressed tight, the expression of a man who'd held himself together in a situation that hadn't resolved. The cattle are back on the right side, he said. For now. And the men from the Harker place? He hung his hat. They're gone. For now. He looked at the table. She'd set it for dinner, the bread, a pot of bean soup from the ham hock and the onions from the garden, 2 plain plates. He looked at it the way he sometimes looked at things she'd done around the house, not with surprise, exactly, but with the slightly recalibrating expression of a man who kept revising an expectation. Sit down, she said. You've been up since before 4. He sat, he ate. After a few minutes, he said, Dalton Harker is going to be a continuing issue. Tom told me. Tom talks more than he used to. Tom was worried about you, she said. He glanced at her. Tom worries about the cattle. Tom worries about you, she said again, pleasantly and firmly. He's known you 14 years. He might not say it in those words, but that is what was happening in his face when he talked about the fence situation. Nathaniel ate his soup. He had the expression of a man being told something true that he wasn't sure he wanted to accept. The Harker situation can be handled, he said. I'm going to write to the county surveyor again and have the property line formally remarked. If Harker cuts a clearly marked survey line, that's a different conversation with the marshal. What if the marshal still doesn't act? Then I'll go higher, he said. I've got a lawyer in Denver I've been in contact with. It's slow. But you're patient, she said. With legal situations, he said, not always with other things. She looked at him. He was eating his soup with his eyes on the bowl, not offering more explanation. She didn't press for it. The curtains are done, she said. The second one. I want you to look at them when you're done eating and tell me if they'll do. He looked up. You finished them? Last section this morning, she said. I had time while the bread was rising. He pushed back from the table when he'd finished his soup, and she followed him to the front room, and he stood looking at the curtains, hanging in the window she'd put them up this morning, wanting to see how they hung. Whether the repairs distorted the fall of the fabric. They didn't. The repairs were clean, nearly invisible in the faded blue. The pattern matched as well as she'd been able to manage. He stood there looking at them for a long time. They look like they always did, he said. His voice was quiet. That was the point, she said. He didn't say anything more. He reached out and touched the hem of the one she'd worked hardest. Touch. Just the backs of his fingers against the fabric. The way you touched something you were trying to verify was real. She looked away. Something about the moment felt private, something between him and the curtain and whatever he was remembering, and she didn't need to be part of it. Thank you, he said finally. It's work, she said. We agreed on work. It's more than that, he said. And you know it. She didn't argue. She went back to the kitchen. 3 weeks into her time at the ranch, she woke in the middle of the night to the sound of voices she didn't recognize. She lay still for a moment, listening. The voices were outside, 2 of them, low, moving along the south side of the house. Not raised, not alarmed, Deliberate. She got up. She moved to the window and looked out without lifting the curtain, just a sliver of view through the edge of the frame. Two men on horseback stopped 30 feet from the house. She couldn't see their faces clearly in the dark, but she could see the way they were sitting easy, like men who'd come somewhere they meant to be. Like men making a point, she went to the hallway. Nathaniel's door was already open, and he was already moving toward the front of the house, boots on, and she realized he'd heard it first, or hadn't been sleeping. "Who is it?" she said quietly. "Go to your room," he said. "Who is it?" He looked at her in the hallway dark. The set of his jaw was like iron. "Harker's men," he said. "Go back to your room, Miss Marlowe." "I won't," she said. He looked at her for one full second, and then made the decision not to waste time arguing. He went to the front door. She followed him. He stepped out onto the porch. She stood in the doorway behind him. The two men outside hadn't moved. One of them called out, easy and mocking, "Just passing by, Calloway. Just making sure you're settled in for the night." "You're on my land," Nathaniel said. His voice was absolutely level. "You've got 2 minutes to get off of it." "Harker wanted us to pass along a message," the man said. "He's prepared to offer a fair price on the east acreage. Water rights included. He says you should think about it." "I've thought about it," Nathaniel said. "The answer is the same as it's been. Now get off my land." The man on the horse had spotted Evelyn in the doorway. She could see it in the way his head turned. "Didn't know you had company, Calloway." "Who's the men?" He stopped. Even from 30 feet in the dark, she could hear the shift in his voice as he took in her silhouette, her shape, her obvious pregnancy. She heard the tone he was building toward. "You need to stop right there," Nathaniel said. He took one step forward off the porch, and something in how he moved, the absolute quiet deliberateness of it, no rush, no flinch, just a man stepping forward and meaning every inch of it, made the horse sidestep nervously under the rider. "Whatever you were about to say, you need to stop before you say it." Silence. The two men looked at each other. 2 minutes, Nathaniel said. Started about a minute ago. They left. The sound of the hoofbeats faded south, and then there was just the wind and the grass and the dark. Evelyn stood in the doorway. Her heart was hammering, not from fear, she realized not exactly. More from something that had no name yet. Something about watching a man step off a porch in the dark and put himself between her and a voice that was building toward cruelty, without drama, without performance. Just because it was the obvious right thing to do. Nathaniel turned around. He looked at her for a moment. "You should have stayed in your room," he said. "Probably," she agreed. He looked at her for one more beat, and then he said, "You're not afraid." "I'm afraid," she said. "I'm just not going to stand in a back room while something happens in my front doorway." Something crossed his face. She couldn't read all of it, but some of it she could. "Go sleep," he said. "They won't be back tonight." She went. She lay down on the rope bed with her hands on her belly and stared at the ceiling and listened to the ranch settle back into its silence around her. She thought, this is not what I expected this to be. She had expected to be managed, tolerated. She had expected a man who offered help with expectations attached, who was kind in the way of someone keeping a ledger. She had expected, when she looked honestly at it, to eventually find the catch. There was always a catch. She was still waiting for it. She pressed her hands flat on her belly, feeling the child shift beneath them, that small insistent movement that was becoming familiar now, recognizable, a presence that was becoming a person the more she paid attention to it. "I don't know what this is yet," she whispered, "but I think we're going to be all right." The ranch was quiet outside. She thought she believed it this time. She had started to believe in mornings again. That was the thing she noticed somewhere in the 5th week, that she woke up without the first thought being dread. For months before Red Willow, before the platform, before any of this, her first conscious moment every morning had been a kind of bracing, a tensing against whatever the day was going to require of her. She'd gotten so used to it that she'd stopped recognizing it as unusual. It had just been what mornings were. Now she woke to coffee smell, and the sound of the ranch breathing around her, and the baby moving in her belly like a small, persistent reminder that there was a future coming, whether she was ready for it or not. And she thought, today. Just today, that's enough. She had been at the Callaway Ranch for 34 days. She knew the number because she'd been keeping a careful accounting in the back of the small notebook she carried. Not obsessively, not the way a woman marks time in a place she's waiting to leave, but the way someone kept track of a new thing, wanting to know its shape. 34 days of bread and mending and garden work, and the slow, careful business of learning a place well enough to move through it without thinking. She knew which floorboard in the hallway creaked loudest and would wake Nathaniel if she got up in the night. She knew that Tom Bright took his coffee black and scalding, and that if she had a slice of something baked waiting when he came in at midday, he would eat it without comment, but his whole face would shift slightly, soften. The way a man's face shifted when something exceeded what he'd expected from the world. She knew that Nathaniel came in from the evening chores at almost exactly the same time every night, and that he always checked the east fence line last, and that when something on the range had gone badly, his boots were louder on the porch steps. Not dramatically louder, just a half-degree more weight in each step, the sound of a man carrying something extra. She knew these things the way she'd always known things, by paying attention. By being present. It was what she'd always done, and no one had ever seemed to notice, and she had long since stopped expecting them to. Nathaniel noticed. That was the thing she hadn't expected. Not in a performed way, not in the way a man noticed things when he was trying to demonstrate that he noticed things. Just in the matter-of-fact, almost incidental way of someone who was also paying attention, who registered what was happening around him with the same quiet precision he applied to weather and fence lines and the condition of his cattle. He'd come in 3 nights ago and found her at the kitchen table with her notebook and her small tin of coins, working out a careful accounting of what she owed him for the room and the food and the supplies she'd used in her sewing work, cross-referenced against what her labor had produced: the mending, the bread, the garden, the ongoing cooking. She'd been trying to figure if the exchange was fair. She was constitutionally incapable of being in a situation she didn't understand the terms of. He'd looked at what she was doing and said, "What are you calculating?" "Whether I'm earning my place fairly," she said. He'd sat down across from her and looked at the notebook. "Can I see?" She'd pushed it across the table. He'd studied it for a minute, her neat columns, her careful arithmetic, and then he'd looked up and said, "You're undervaluing your labor by about half." She'd stared at him. "I'm being realistic about market rates for the bread alone," he said, "would cost me 30 cents a loaf from the Harker's Creek Bakehouse. When they have it, which is not always. You've baked 11 loaves in the last 2 weeks. He pushed the notebook back. "You're not a burden on this ranch, Miss Marlowe. If anything, the arithmetic runs the other direction." She'd looked at her notebook. Then she'd looked at him. "You're not just saying that." "I don't just say things," he said. She'd closed the notebook. She hadn't known what to do with the information exactly, but she'd held it carefully, turned it over a few times, and let it settle into a place alongside the other things she was slowly, cautiously beginning to allow herself to believe. So she had started to believe in mornings again, and then came the morning of the 35th day. She heard the horse before she saw the rider. She was in the garden with a basket, pulling the last of the onions before the first frost came. The air had that particular sharpness now that meant cold was building somewhere to the north, and she heard a single rider coming in from the east road at a pace that wasn't urgent but wasn't casual either. The kind of pace that said, "I know where I'm going, and I've thought about how I'm going to arrive." She stood up from the onions. She saw the horse, first a good horse, better than a working animal, with the groomed look of a horse someone took care of for reasons beyond utility. Then the rider, and even from 50 yards, even with the sun coming over his left shoulder and throwing his face partly into shadow, she knew. She knew the way you knew things that had been burned into you. The basket dropped from her hands. The onions rolled in the dirt. Caleb Whitmore rode through the ranch gate like a man returning from a short trip, easy in the saddle, one hand loose on the reins, and he looked at her standing in the garden, and he had the audacity, the absolute, breathtaking audacity to smile. "Evelyn," he said, "there you are. There you are." Like she was a mislaid object. Like she was something he'd set down somewhere and come back to collect. Her body did something interesting. It went completely still. Not the stillness of fear. She examined it quickly and honestly, and it was not fear. Or not only fear. It was the stillness of a woman who had spent 35 days rebuilding something inside herself, and who felt in this moment exactly what was at stake. "Caleb," she said. Her voice came out level. She was almost surprised by it. He swung down from the horse and tied it to the fence post, and walked toward her with the loose-limbed ease of a man who expected to be welcomed. He looked at her face, at her belly, at the basket on the ground, and his expression arranged itself into something that was supposed to look like remorse. "I've been looking for you," he said. "You have not," she said. He stopped. He tilted his head slightly, recalibrating. "Evelyn, you left me on a platform," she said, "in a town I'd never been to. With no money to speak of and no plan and a child coming. You did not look for me." She decided I was taken care of by the simple fact that I was no longer your problem. She kept her voice even. It cost her something to keep it even. So let's not begin with something that isn't true. He looked at her for a moment. Behind his eyes, something shifted. She'd seen it before. This particular shift, the moment when Caleb Whitmore decided that the soft approach wasn't going to work and moved to something else. He'd always had two ways, soft first, then something harder wrapped in soft language. "I made a mistake," he said. "A man can panic." "A man can," she said, "and then a man can also find a telegraph office. Or write a letter. Or do any of the 100 things that exist between abandonment and suddenly appearing 6 weeks later on someone else's property." "I heard you'd found a situation," he said. He looked past her toward the house, a sweeping assessment. "Seems like a decent enough place." "Whose ranch is this?" said a voice from the direction of the barn. She hadn't heard Nathaniel come out. He must have heard the horse, or heard her voice carrying across the yard. She would never know which. He was standing 20 feet back, hat on, thumbs in his belt, and he was looking at Caleb Whitmore with the careful, measuring expression of a man who had already drawn a fairly complete picture from what he'd just heard. Caleb turned. He took Nathaniel in the height, the stillness, the quality of attention, and she could see him adjusting his calculations. "Calloway," he said. He smiled again, the one that was supposed to put people at ease. "Caleb Whitmore. I'm an old friend of Evelyn's, I heard," Nathaniel said. He did not move toward Caleb. He did not extend a hand. He just stood. Caleb's smile held but thinned slightly at the edges. "I've come to speak with Evelyn," he said, "if you don't mind." "I do mind," Nathaniel said. "I beg your pardon?" "I mind," Nathaniel said again, simply and completely without heat. "She's on my property, and she's told you what she thinks about your story. If she wants more conversation with you, that's her choice to make. But you're not going to stand in my yard and talk to her like you found something you misplaced." Caleb's face did something complicated. The ease drained out of it slowly, replaced by something cooler. He looked at Evelyn. "Is this the situation you've landed yourself in? You're going to let this man speak for you?" "He's not speaking for me," she said. "He's saying what I would have said if I'd gotten there first." She met his gaze straight on. "What do you actually want, Caleb? And I mean actually. Because the story about looking for me and making a mistake, I'll set that aside. What did you come here for?" The cool thing in his face settled into something flatter. This was the third version of Caleb Whitmore, the one underneath the soft and the calculated, just flat and direct when he'd decided the other approaches weren't yielding results. "I want to talk about the child," he said. "My child." The word landed in the yard like something thrown. Nathaniel didn't move, but she felt the change in him. The air around him tightened slightly, a gathering stillness, like the moment before weather. "Your child," she said. "I have a right. You have no rights," she said, and her voice came out harder now, the steadiness giving way to something with edges. "You forfeited whatever rights you might have claimed on a platform in Red Willow, Kansas, when you walked away from a pregnant woman, and didn't look back. Rights are built from responsibility, Caleb. You took none. You have none. The law might see it differently, he said. The law, Nathaniel said quietly, would start by wanting to know why a man abandoned a woman in her condition, with no means of support and no destination. That's a conversation I'd be interested in having, with the marshal, myself if you want to start talking about what the law sees. Caleb looked at him. The calculation was open in his face. Now he wasn't bothering to hide it anymore. You've got a nice setup here, Calloway, he said. Good land. I can see why you'd want to complicate it with extra arrangements. The implication was so deliberate and so ugly that for a moment the yard was just silence. Nathaniel took one step forward, just one. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't reach for anything. He just took one step, slow and absolute, and looked at Caleb Whitmore with the full, unguarded weight of what he thought about that implication. You're going to take that back, he said. Right now. Caleb held his ground for exactly 3 seconds. Then something in him recognized something in Nathaniel, the specific quality of a man who meant precisely what he said and had no interest in escalating past what was necessary, and he shifted his weight. I know what you meant, Nathaniel said. And you're going to take it back, and then you're going to get on your horse and ride off my property. Silence. I'll come back, Caleb said. He was looking at Evelyn now, not Nathaniel, and the look had changed again. It had gone back to something softer, but it was a softness with intention behind it, a softness that was a strategy. When you've had time to think, Evelyn, I'll come back and we can talk properly. There is nothing proper to talk about, she said. He untied his horse. He mounted with the practiced ease of a man who wanted to make every exit look like a choice. At the gate he turned in the saddle and looked back. You deserve better than this, he said. He made a gesture that took in the ranch, the yard, Nathaniel standing in the middle of it. You deserve a real future. I'm building one, she said. He rode. She stood in the garden and watched him go until the sound of the hoofbeats faded entirely, and then she stood there a moment more just to be sure, just to let her body catch up to what had happened. Her hands were shaking. Not badly, a fine tremor, the kind the body produced when it had held something very tightly for several minutes and then released. She pressed them flat against her belly and breathed. Nathaniel was beside her. Not touching her, not crowding her, just there present, close enough that she knew he was there, far enough that she had her own air. You all right, he said. Yes, she said, then no. Not completely. She looked at him. I will be. He nodded. He bent down and picked up the basket from the ground and began gathering the onions that had rolled in the dirt, picking each one up and checking it before putting it back in the basket, the same thorough care he brought to everything. She watched him do it. He might come back, she said. He might, Nathaniel said. What do you want to do if he does? He put the last onion in the basket and stood up and looked at her, and his expression was different from anything she'd seen on his face before, not the controlled neutrality, not the careful consideration. Something more direct, something that had decided something. I want to handle it the same way, he said, unless you want it handled differently. I don't, she said. He handed her the basket. Their hands were close on the handle for a moment, not quite touching, but close, and then she took the basket and he stepped back. Bread's going to burn if you don't get inside, he said. She went inside. She stood in the kitchen for a long moment, her hands on the bread pan, not moving. The bread was fine. She'd checked it before she went out to the garden, and it had needed another 20 minutes. She just needed a moment to stand still in a room and let the last hour settle into its proper place in her understanding of things. Caleb Whitmore had come back, and she had stood in the dirt of someone else's garden with onions at her feet, and she had looked at the man who had broken her life apart, and she had not crumbled. She had not begged. She had not rearranged herself to fit what he wanted. She had told him the truth in plain language and let it land where it landed. That was new. She pressed her hands against the edge of the counter and made herself feel the solidness of it, the real, present, physical reality of this kitchen, this stove, this bread. This 35 days of something she had built one day at a time from nothing. He didn't get to walk in here and take that. That thought was so clear and so certain that it was almost like hearing it said aloud. He didn't get to walk in here and take that. She checked the bread. It needed 15 more minutes. She put it back and went to the front room and sat down with her sewing, and she sewed with great precision and great concentration for exactly the time it took the bread to finish. And then she went back and took it out of the oven and set it to cool, and put the kettle on. Tom came in at midday, and she gave him his coffee and his slice of bread, and he ate it at the table, and gave her his usual measuring look, and then said, "Saw a rider coming out of the East Road this morning." "An old acquaintance," she said. Tom was quiet for a moment. He drank his coffee. "Nate said the same thing," he said. Almost the exact same words. She met his eyes. "Some acquaintances," Tom said, finishing his coffee and standing, "don't need to be accommodated. Some of them need to be shown the property line and left on the other side of it." He took his hat from the hook by the door. "Just a working man's opinion," he left. She sat with her own coffee for a moment after the door closed. She hadn't expected Tom Bright to have opinions about her circumstances. She hadn't expected the bread to matter to him, or the coffee, or any of it. She had expected to be tolerated, and instead she searched for the right word included. Quietly, without ceremony, without anyone making a speech about it. Just included in the daily fabric of this place, as though she had always had a thread in it. She didn't know what to do with that either, so she put it alongside the other things she was accumulating, and let it sit. The afternoon went quiet, the way afternoons did on the ranch when the morning's work was done and the evenings hadn't started yet. She finished 2 of the shirts in the mending pile, and started on the 3rd, working through the collar repair, with the small, neat stitches she'd learned from her grandmother, always smaller than you think you need to go. Her grandmother had said, because small stitches hold longer and show less. She heard the wagon before she heard the voice. She'd been concentrating so hard on a particularly difficult seam at the shoulder of Nathaniel's second-best shirt that she'd half-tuned out the sounds of the yard. So it was the sudden stillness outside the wagon, stopping. Tom's voice raised slightly that brought her head up. She put the sewing down and went to the window. The wagon was from town. She recognized the horse, but not the woman sitting in it, a woman of about 60. Straight-backed, in a dark traveling dress. Being helped down from the wagon by Tom, with an expression that suggested she helped herself down from wagons and was permitting Tom the courtesy as a concession to social form. Mrs. Aldrich, the woman from the dry goods store. Evelyn felt her spine straighten involuntarily. She set down the shirt and stood up. She heard the knock at the front door, and she went to answer it, and there was Mrs. Aldrich on the porch, removing her gloves one finger at a time, and behind her Tom retreating tactfully toward the barn. "Miss Marlowe," Mrs. Aldrich said. "Mrs. Aldrich," she said. She did not step back from the doorway. The older woman looked at her for a moment with those watchful eyes. "I've brought some things," she said. She held up a basket covered with a cloth. "For the baby." Evelyn stared at her. "Some flannel," Mrs. Aldrich said. "2 lengths, and a pattern I used for my own children if you want it, though you may have your own." She paused. "I also brought there are some women in town who have talked about sending things. I told them I'd come first and see if you wanted them." Evelyn looked at the basket. She looked at Mrs. Aldrich. "Why?" she said. The older woman's mouth did something complicated. "Because I was not kind to you when you came into my store," she said. "And because I've known Nathaniel Calloway for 10 years, and he is a man whose judgment I trust, and if he's brought a woman onto his property and kept her there a month, she is worth more consideration than I showed her." She held out the basket. "That's all." Evelyn took the basket. She stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. "There's bread fresh this morning, and the kettle's still hot." Something shifted in Mrs. Aldrich's face, not quite surprise, but something adjacent to it, as though she'd prepared herself for a door that stayed closed and found herself recalibrating for one that didn't. "That's kind of you," she said, and stepped inside. They sat at the kitchen table, the 2 of them, and drank coffee and ate bread and talked carefully at first, the way two women talked when they were testing the ground, and then with increasing ease, the way they talked when they realized the ground would hold. Mrs. Aldrich had come to Kansas from Virginia. It turned out, 30 years ago, with her husband, who had died 15 years back. She'd run the store herself since then. She had 4 children, 3 living and 8 grandchildren, 2 of whom were out on the Colorado range working cattle. She knew this land the way you knew something you'd survived, which was different from knowing it any other way. "You're not what I expected," Mrs. Aldrich said, when the coffee was nearly gone. "What did you expect?" Evelyn asked. "I don't know exactly," she said. "Something harder, maybe, or something more broken." She considered her words with care. "You've had a difficult situation, and you don't look like it's caved you in." "It nearly did," Evelyn said. "But it didn't," no, Evelyn said. "It didn't." Mrs. Aldrich looked at her with those sharp, assessing eyes, and this time the assessment felt different from the one in the store, less a judgment and more a recognition. The way one person recognized something in another that they'd seen before in a mirror. "Good," she said simply. She stayed an hour and then left, and Evelyn stood on the porch and watched the wagon go, and thought about the strange, unpredictable ways a life rearranged itself when you stopped trying to control the rearranging. She went back inside. She picked up Nathaniel's shirt and found the shoulder seam and began sewing again. An hour later Nathaniel came in, and she heard him stop in the hallway. A pause. "Was someone here?" "Mrs. Aldrich," she said. From the dry goods store. He appeared in the doorway of the front room. What did she want? "She brought things for the baby," Evelyn said. She kept her eyes on the seam, and to apologize in her way. She didn't say the word, but it was there. Nathaniel leaned against the door frame. "She's a harder woman than she looks," he said. "But she's fair, underneath it." "I've known her to come around." "She said she'd trust your judgment," Evelyn said. "Did she?" "She said if you'd kept someone on your property a month, that person was worth consideration." He was quiet for a moment. "She's not wrong," he said. Evelyn kept sewing. She didn't look up because she didn't trust what was on her face right now, not anything dramatic, not anything she needed to hide exactly, just something too new to be easy about yet. Something that required a little more time before she could look at it directly in the light. "Caleb's not gone," she said. "You know that." "I know," Nathaniel said. "He's the kind of man who needs the last word, who needs to feel like he chose the ending." She paused. "He'll come back. Let him," Nathaniel said. She looked up then. He was still in the doorway, his arms crossed, his hat pushed back slightly on his head. And he was looking at her with a directness that she'd gotten used to in theory, but still sometimes surprised her in practice, the way he looked at things he'd decided about. "You're not on that platform anymore," he said. The words hit somewhere in her chest she hadn't known was unguarded. She felt them land, and she held very still around them, the way you held still around something fragile until you knew if it would hold. "No," she said, "I'm not." He pushed off the doorframe. "Dinner'll be ready whenever you are," he said, and went to the kitchen, and she heard the stove door open, and the sound of logs being added, and the ordinary business of the evening beginning. She sat with his shirt in her lap, and the needle in her fingers, and the lamplight going gold around her, and she thought, something is happening here. Something real and slow and terrifying, and she searched for the right word and found it, surprised by it. Something right. She was not ready to say it out loud. She wasn't sure she was ready to say it even to herself. But it was there. She put the needle through the fabric. Small stitches, hold longer, show less. She finished the seam. Outside, the sky was going the particular dark blue it went before full dark in the high country, that brief, luminous hour that made everything look like the world was being lit from inside. And somewhere down in the valley a coyote called out, high and thin and unashamed, and the ranch held its breath, and the evening came down, and Evelyn Marlowe sat in the lamplight of a house that was beginning slowly, carefully, stitch by stitch, to feel like something that might be hers. The knock came 2 days later, not a polite knock. 3 hard raps, the kind that were meant to be heard as a statement, before the door even opened. Nathaniel got there first, but Evelyn was right behind him. She looked over his shoulder and saw Caleb on the porch, but this time he hadn't come alone. There was a man beside him, a stranger, well-dressed, carrying a leather satchel. The kind of man who got paid by the word and the page. "I've brought someone I'd like you to meet," Caleb said. His voice had the particular smoothness of a man who had spent the last 2 days preparing what he was going to say, and was pleased with how it sounded. "This is Harold Fitch. He's a lawyer from Dodge City." Evelyn felt the ground shift slightly under her feet. Nathaniel said nothing. He held the door but did not open it wider. "I'd like to discuss the matter of my child," Caleb said. "Legally, properly." He looked past Nathaniel to Evelyn, and his eyes had that flat, prepared quality, the look of a man who has stopped improvising and started executing a plan. "I have rights, Evelyn. Mr. Fitch is going to explain them." The lawyer opened his satchel, and the evening, which had been so ordinary and so good, turned into something else entirely. Nathaniel did not open the door wider. He stood in the doorway with his hand on the frame and looked at Harold Fitch and his leather satchel with the particular expression he reserved for things that required him to think carefully before he acted, not the cold fury he'd shown when Harker's men had cut his fence, not the flat wall he'd put up when Caleb came the first time. Something more deliberate than either of those. Something that was calculating odds. "Mr. Fitch," he said. The lawyer had the practiced neutrality of a man who showed up in difficult situations for a living, and had learned not to take the temperature of a room personally. "Mr. Calloway," he said, "I apologize for the hour." Mr. Whitmore was insistent about the timing. "I'm sure he was," Nathaniel said. Evelyn stepped around Nathaniel into the doorway beside him. She had made a decision in the 2 seconds it took her to process what she was looking at: the lawyer, the satchel, Caleb's prepared face, and the decision was that she was not going to be managed to the side of her own situation. "What exactly does Mr. Whitmore believe a lawyer from Dodge City is going to accomplish tonight?" she said. Fitch looked at her. He had the brief recalibration of a man who had been briefed to expect one kind of woman and was finding another. "Miss Marlowe," he said, "Mr. Whitmore has asked me to outline his legal position with regard to the child." "He believes a conversation. The child is not born yet," she said. "Mr. Whitmore has made no financial contribution to this pregnancy. He has provided no support, no contact, and no presence since he left me on a platform in Red Willow, Kansas, on the 14th of July. She kept her voice level and precise. "If Mr. Whitmore believes he has a legal position worth discussing, he is welcome to put it in a letter and send it to me through the post, and I will read it and consider it and respond through whatever proper channels are appropriate. What he does not get to do is bring a lawyer to a man's front door at 7 in the evening and demand an audience." Fitch blinked. He looked at Caleb. Caleb's prepared expression had developed a crack in it. "Evelyn, I'm not finished," she said. "You came here 2 days ago and I told you clearly that this conversation was done. You've now brought a lawyer, which I understand is meant to impress me or frighten me into cooperating." "It does neither." She looked at Fitch. "I have nothing against you personally, Mr. Fitch. You're doing a job. But there is nothing to discuss tonight, and I would ask you both to leave this property." Silence on the porch. Nathaniel had not said a word. He had stood beside her and let her speak, and had not moved a muscle to interrupt or redirect or soften anything she'd said, and the quality of his presence beside her was the most useful thing anyone had done for her in years, not his words. Not his intervention, just him standing there like a man who had decided where he stood and had no intention of moving. Fitch put his hand on his satchel strap and looked at Caleb. Caleb's crack was widening. "You can't just," he started. "She just did," Nathaniel said. 3 words, quiet as anything. But they had the quality of a door closing with perfect finality, and everyone on that porch heard it the same way. Caleb looked at Nathaniel, then he looked at Evelyn. And the look he gave her, the last one, before the mask came down completely, and what was underneath showed through, was not soft, and it was not calculated. It was just cold, and she recognized it for what it was, the look of a man who had believed that her situation made her manageable, who had expected to walk onto this property and find a frightened woman grateful for the attention, and who was confronting the fact that he had miscalculated badly. "We'll be in Harker's Creek until Friday," he said. His voice had gone flat. "If you change your mind." "I won't," she said. They left. She stood in the doorway until the sound of them was entirely gone, the hoofbeats, the squeak of Fitch's rented wagon, and then she stepped back inside, and Nathaniel closed the door, and they stood in the hallway in the quiet. Her hands were shaking again, same as before, the fine tremor of something held tightly and then let go. "You should sit down," Nathaniel said. "I'm all right." "You're shaking." She looked at her hands. "Yes," she said. "But I'm all right. Those are different things." He looked at her for a moment. "Come to the kitchen," he said. Not an order, an offer, with the quiet certainty of someone who knew that what was needed was hot coffee and a solid chair. She came to the kitchen. He put the kettle on. She sat at the table and pressed both hands flat on the pine surface and breathed. In through the nose, hold, out through the mouth. The baby moved along. Slow roll, not the sharp jab of distress, just the steady movement of a child settling. And she pressed one hand to the spot and felt it and thought, "We are all right." "We are still all right. He's going to try something else," she said. "Caleb, he won't stop at a lawyer." Nathaniel set 2 cups on the table. "No," he agreed. "He's the kind of man who needs to win," she said. "Not because he actually wants the thing he's fighting for. He doesn't want this baby. He doesn't want me. What he wants is to not have lost." She looked up. Men like that are dangerous exactly because their goal keeps changing. When one approach doesn't work, they don't give up, they just find a different angle. Nathaniel sat down across from her. "I know men like that," he said. "What do you do with them?" He was quiet for a moment. "You make sure everything they might use against you is handled correctly," he said. Legally, on paper, he looked at her with that direct, considering look. "I wrote to my lawyer in Denver last week, after Caleb's first visit." She stared at him. "You did?" "I told him the situation and asked him what legal exposure you might have and what protections were available. He said it the way he said everything, without drama, as though writing to lawyers was just a thing that needed doing. He sent back a reply yesterday. I was going to talk to you about it when the timing was right." "The timing is right now," she said. He went to his desk in the corner of the main room and came back with a letter which he set on the table between them. She read it. It was 3 pages, dense with legal language, but she read carefully, and the essential meaning was clear enough. Caleb Whitmore's legal claim to a child not yet born, from a woman he had demonstrably abandoned without financial provision, in a state where he was not a resident, was considerably thinner than a man with a leather satchel turning up at dinner time was meant to imply. He was bluffing, she said. Mostly, Nathaniel said. He has some standing once the child is born, but less than he was presenting. And any claim he makes would require him to demonstrate he'd met his obligations, which he hasn't. She set the letter down. She thought about it. "You did this before tonight," she said. "Before he showed up with the lawyer." "Yes, why?" He looked at her steadily. "Because he was going to come back," he said. "And because I wanted to know what the ground looked like before he did." She held his gaze. Something about the simple practicality of it, the way he had seen what was coming and quietly prepared. Not to take control of the situation, but to make sure she had what she needed to handle it, hit her somewhere that had been closed for a very long time. "Thank you," she said. The words were not adequate, but they were what she had. "Don't thank me," he said. "It needed doing." She looked at the letter on the table. She looked at her hands, which had stopped shaking. She looked at the coffee cup Nathaniel had set in front of her, and the lamplight falling across the table, and the way the kitchen felt solid, warm, real, and she thought, 35 days ago I was on a platform with nothing. And now I am sitting in a kitchen with a man who wrote to a lawyer in Denver before I thought to ask him to, because he could see what was coming, and he wanted me to have what I needed. She picked up her coffee. "Tell me about James," she said. He looked slightly surprised, not by the question exactly, but by the timing of it, the shift. "My boy, your boy," she said. "You said he comes in the summer." What's he like? He settled back in his chair. Something in him eased the held tension of the last hour, releasing slowly. He's 15, he said, taller than I expected him to be. He's got his mother's coloring and my stubbornness, which is not the most convenient combination. The corner of his mouth moved just slightly. He's good with horses, better than I was at his age. He reads everything he can get his hands on. My sister sends him books from Denver, and he goes through them like a fire through dry grass. Does he know about me? She said. Being here? I wrote to him, Nathaniel said. What did you say? I said there was a woman staying at the ranch who was helping with the house and who was in a difficult situation, and that I expected him to treat her with respect when he came in June. He paused. He wrote back and asked if I was going to marry her. Evelyn's cup stopped halfway to her mouth. He's 15, Nathaniel said. He sees things in straight lines. What did you tell him? He looked at her across the table, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded she'd seen from him, not the controlled calm, not the deliberate stillness. Just a man who was choosing, in this particular moment, to be honest rather than careful. I told him that wasn't a conversation for a letter, he said. The kitchen was very quiet. Evelyn set her cup down. She looked at the table, at the letter, at her own hands. She had been so careful. She had told herself to be so careful to not see things that weren't there, to not let gratitude become something else, to not mistake the warmth of being treated with basic decency for something rarer and more specific. But there it was on the table between them, plain as the pine boards. It wasn't something she'd invented. She looked up. He was still looking at her with that honest expression, not pushing it, not retreating from it, just letting it be there. Nathaniel, she said. It was the first time she'd used his first name. She hadn't planned it. It came out because it was what the moment required. Evelyn, he said, and that was all for right now. It was enough for right now. The baby came earlier than she'd expected. Not dangerously early. Dr. Harker in town had said the child was healthy and positioned well, and that the timing could run anywhere from the last week of September to the middle of October. And so when the first pains came on a Thursday morning in the second week of October, she thought for nearly an hour that it was false labor, the practice kind. The kind that had woken her twice in the last 2 weeks, and then settled back into nothing. It was not that kind. She knew the difference when the second wave came deeper, more definite, the kind of pain that had a direction to it, a purpose. She was in the kitchen when it hit, and she put both hands on the counter and breathed through it and waited for it to pass. And when it passed, she stood up and looked at the clock on the kitchen wall. 22 minutes since the first one. She went to the back door. Nathaniel was at the barn. She could hear him moving in there, the sounds of the morning feed. She opened the door and called his name, not loudly, not in panic. Just clearly. He came out of the barn immediately. He read something in her voice or her posture or her face, she couldn't have said which, and he was crossing the yard at a steady, fast walk before she'd said another word. It's time, she said. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her with the same complete attention he brought to every practical emergency. But underneath it, in the very back of his eyes, was something else, something that was not calm and was not controlled. Something that was just a person being frightened for someone they cared about and not allowing the fear to get in the way of what needed doing. Tom's at the Hendersons today, he said. I know. I can ride for the doctor. Not enough time, she said. I know what I'm saying, Nathaniel. There isn't time. She had been through this once before, a miscarriage 4 years ago, early and awful, but it had taught her the specific language of her own body, and she was reading it clearly now. I need you to stay. He looked at her for a fraction of a second that contained a great number of things. Then he said, all right, tell me what you need, she told him. She was clear and specific, and she kept her voice steady because she needed it to be steady, because panic was a luxury neither of them could afford right now, and he listened with total focus and did not interrupt and did not flinch from any of it. He helped her inside. He built the fire in the bedroom stove until the room was warm. He brought water and clean cloth and the extra blankets from the chest at the foot of the bed, and he arranged everything the way she told him to, and then he pulled the chair to the side of the bed, and he sat down. "I'm not leaving," he said. "I know," she said. She had been afraid of this, not of the pain. Not exactly. She had made her peace with the pain weeks ago, understood it as the price of the thing she was getting, but of this specific vulnerability. Of being seen in this. She had spent so much of her life making sure that when hard things happened to her, they happened in private, where no one could use the difficulty of them against her. Where no one could look at her most exposed, and walk away with a picture of it. She looked at Nathaniel sitting in the plain wooden chair beside her bed, his hat set aside, his hands on his knees, his whole body oriented toward her with the particular steadiness of a man who had decided to be present, and was going to honor that decision, no matter what the next several hours required of him. She thought, this is not that. This is not the kind of looking that takes something from you. She held on to that thought for the next 4 hours. He talked to her not constantly, not in the performed way of someone filling silence because they were afraid of it, but at the right moments. The way a person talked who understood that a voice was something to hold on to when the body was working hard. He told her about James at age 4, the summer after Ellen died, how the boy had developed a habit of following Tom Bright around the ranch like a shadow, and how Tom, who was not a particularly expressive man, had nevertheless managed to be exactly what a motherless 4-year-old needed, patient and present and steady. "He's a good man," Evelyn said, through clenched teeth, riding the peak of a contraction. "The best I know," Nathaniel said. "Hold on, breathe." She breathed. He told her about the first winter on the ranch, when the snow had come in October and not left until April, and he'd lost 11 head and nearly the barn roof. And how he'd sat in this kitchen with Ellen, and they'd looked at their accounts, and Ellen had said very calmly, "We didn't come out here to give up in the first winter." And they hadn't. "She sounds like someone worth knowing," Evelyn said. "She was," he said. "You'd have liked each other. You have the same way of looking at problems." "What way is that?" "Like they're problems to be solved," he said. "Not evidence of something wrong with you." She held that while another wave came, and when it passed she said, "I haven't always managed that." "Neither did she," he said, "but she mostly got there." "And so will you." 2 hours into it, she asked him to hold her hand, and he did. Without hesitation, without making it a thing, just took her hand in both of his and held it, solid and warm. And she gripped it when she needed to, and he didn't wince or pull back or make a sound, just let her hold as hard as she needed to. She had held the hands of 2 women through labor, her cousin, and a neighbor in Philadelphia. She knew what it cost to sit beside someone in that kind of pain and stay present in it, rather than retreating to the footful busyness of the far side of the room. It cost something real. It required you to be willing to be inside the difficulty with someone, rather than adjacent to it. He was inside it with her. She understood in the middle of the 4th hour that she had not been alone in a very long time. Not since the ranch, not since the spare room and the coffee smell and the curtains. What she had thought was the loneliness of not knowing what was happening between them had actually been something else entirely. It had been the unfamiliar sensation of someone being present, and her not knowing what to do with it because she'd been alone for so long. Then the last hour came, and she stopped thinking about anything at all, except the work in front of her, the oldest and most demanding work there was. And Nathaniel was there, right there, saying, "Breathe and hold on, and you're doing fine. You're doing so fine." And she pushed through the final wave, and then silence, and then not silence. A cry, thin, indignant, furious. The specific fury of someone newly arrived in the world, and already finding it insufficient. Nathaniel made a sound she had never heard from him before, and hoped she could hear again someday, something low and involuntary. The sound a person made when something happened that exceeded every category of thing they had prepared themselves for. She lay back against the pillow and looked at the ceiling and breathed. She's here," he said. His voice was different. "Strip down. She's right here. She's Evelyn. She's all right." He wrapped the baby in the flannel misses. Aldrich had brought, she had thought, 2 weeks ago, to have it ready, to have everything ready, and he brought her to Evelyn and laid her in Evelyn's arms with the extraordinary care of a man handling something irreplaceable. And then he sat back down in the chair and put his elbows on his knees and pressed both hands over his face. Evelyn looked at her daughter. She had dark hair, damp and pressed flat, and her eyes were the milky, unfocused blue of the newly born, and she was wrinkling her face against the light, like she already had opinions about it. And she was the most entirely real thing Evelyn had ever held in her life. "Hello," Evelyn whispered. "Hello, little one. I've been waiting for you." The baby made a sound. Not a cry, some smaller, more considered, like she was already attempting to assess the situation. Evelyn laughed, wet and exhausted and absolutely genuine. She laughed at her own newborn daughter, who was already appearing to have opinions, and the laugh came out of her like something that had been held under pressure for a very long time and was finally being let go. Nathaniel lifted his face from his hands. He was not an expressive man, and he would never be an expressive man, and he had clearly just spent a moment getting himself back together, because that was who he was, but his eyes, when he looked at her and the baby, were completely unguarded. "What will you call her?" he said. She looked at her daughter. She had thought about names for months in Philadelphia before she left, on the train, in the worst hours on the platform, in the quiet of the spare room, and she had had several candidates, names she'd carried like contingencies. But now, looking at the actual face of the actual person, she knew with absolute certainty which one. "Clara," she said, "after my grandmother." He nodded. He reached out one hand and very gently with one finger touched the back of the baby's tiny fist. Clara's hand opened reflexively and closed around his finger. He went absolutely still. She watched his face. "She's got a grip on her," he said quietly. "She's gonna need one," Evelyn said. He looked up at her over the baby's head. His finger still held, and the expression on his face was the one she would carry with her for the rest of her life, the complete, unguarded expression of a man who had been alone for 11 years and had just in this moment understood with his whole self that he was not alone anymore. Neither of them said anything for a long time. Clara held his finger, and the fire in the stove burned low, and the night was completely still outside. The good still, the kind that felt like the world holding its breath, not from dread, but from something else. After a while, Nathaniel said, "I need to send for the doctor in the morning." "Make sure everything." "In the morning," Evelyn said. "And Tom should know." "In the morning," she said again. He looked at her. She was exhausted in a way that went deeper than tired, the kind of exhaustion that came from having spent everything you had and arrived at the other side of it and found solid ground. "Sleep," he said. "Stay," she said. He looked at her steadily. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. She looked back at him with everything she had left, which was not much but was real, and she said, "I know. I think I knew a while ago. I was just..." She paused. "I was being careful," he said. "You had good reasons." "I did," she said. "I still do." "You don't have to stop being careful," he said. "I'm not asking you to stop." She held his gaze. "I know what you're not asking," she said. "I know what you've never asked." She shifted Clara slightly against her chest, feeling the warm, impossibly real weight of her. "Nathaniel, Evelyn, I think," she said slowly, feeling for the right words the way she felt for the right stitch, small, precise, the ones that held without showing, "that I would like you keep not going anywhere. For a long while. If that's something..." She stopped. She tried again. "I'm not good at this," she said. "Neither am I," he said. "I haven't been in a long while." "Then we're even." Something crossed his face, the dry warmth she'd seen in flashes, the thing that was his version of humor, underneath the stillness. "We're even," he said. She settled back against the pillow with Clara on her chest. She was going to sleep in about 3 minutes, whether she chose to or not. But she had 3 minutes, and she used them to look at the man sitting in the plain chair beside the bed, his big hands and his steady eyes, and the 11 years of alone that hadn't made him hard, but had made him something better than hard. Something more useful, and she thought, "I came to this county with $41 and a broken suitcase and a baby coming, and a man who left me on a platform. And I am going to leave it with something I hadn't known to want and couldn't have invented if I'd tried." She closed her eyes. Clara breathed against her chest, small and even and unhurried. And Nathaniel Calloway sat in his chair and did not go anywhere, because he had said he wouldn't, and he was a man who kept his word, and the fire burned low, and outside the night was long and quiet and full of stars. Clara Marlowe was 3 weeks old when Caleb Whitmore made his final mistake. Not his last appearance that came later, and it came differently than anyone expected. But the mistake, the one that unraveled whatever remained of his position, happened on a Tuesday morning in the dry goods store in Harker's Creek. And it happened because Caleb Whitmore had never learned the difference between a woman who was alone and a woman who simply appeared to be. Evelyn didn't know about it until Mrs. Aldrich drove out to the ranch that afternoon with her second wagon in a month, this time without an invitation and without a basket. Just herself and her straight spine and her watchful eyes and the particular expression of a woman who had decided something needed to be said, and had appointed herself to say it. Evelyn answered the door with Clara against her shoulder, the baby making the small snuffling sounds she made when she was deciding whether or not to be annoyed about something. Mrs. Aldrich looked at the baby for one unguarded moment. Something in her face went briefly, completely soft, and then reassembled herself and said, "I need to speak with you, and Nathaniel both." They sat at the kitchen table, the three of them and Mrs. Aldrich told them what had happened. Caleb had been in the store that morning. He'd been in Harker's Creek for nearly 2 weeks, staying at the boarding house, and in that time he'd been having conversations, quiet ones, deliberate ones, the kind of conversations a man had when he was building something. He'd told people that Evelyn had been his intended, that she'd come west to marry him, and then, when circumstances had changed, had placed herself at the Calloway Ranch under an arrangement that was and Mrs. Aldrich's mouth tightened here, not entirely respectable. He had not said anything overtly scandalous. He was too careful for that. He'd said enough to plant a question, the way you planted a seed in dry ground, and then waited for the weather to do the rest of the work. That morning, he'd been in the store when 3 women from the church auxiliary had come in, and he'd said, in a voice calibrated to carry just far enough, that he was concerned about the welfare of his child, being raised in an ambiguous situation, by a woman whose circumstances were, and he'd paused there, that precise surgical pause complicated. Mrs. Aldrich had been behind her counter. "What did you do?" Evelyn said. Mrs. Aldrich looked at her with those sharp eyes. "I told him," she said, "that the only complicated thing I could see in the room was a man who had abandoned a woman in her condition and had the extraordinary nerve to show up 2 months later and use the word welfare." She set her hands flat on the table. "I told him that Evelyn Marlowe had more character in one hand than he had in his entire presentation, and that if he said one more word in my store designed to damage her reputation, I would personally write to every merchant between here and Dodge City and make sure they knew exactly what kind of man they were dealing with." Silence. Evelyn looked at her. The 3 women from the auxiliary, Mrs. Aldrich continued, were Margaret Holt, Louise Crane, and Dottie Ferris. All 3 of them have known me for 20 years. All 3 of them will take my account of this over his. Nathaniel, who had been listening without expression, said, "What did Whitmore do?" "He left," Mrs. Aldrich said, without another word. "He paid for his tobacco and he left." She looked at Evelyn. "I don't know if he'll go quietly. Men like that rarely do. But I wanted you to know that you have allies in that town, and they will not be silent." Evelyn looked at this woman, this bird-boned, silver-haired woman who had looked at her in a store 6 weeks ago with assessment and dismissal, and had driven out here today with her back straight and her hands flat on the table to tell her she was not alone. She thought about all the ways the world had been smaller and crueler than it needed to be, and all the ways, sometimes, unexpectedly, it corrected itself. "Thank you," she said. The words still weren't adequate, and she said them anyway. "Don't thank me," Mrs. Aldrich said, which was so close to something Nathaniel had said to her that she almost smiled. "Just come into town when you're ready. Let them see you. Let them see that child." She glanced at Clara again, and the soft thing crossed her face once more. "She's beautiful. She has opinions," Evelyn said. Good, Mrs. Aldrich said. She'll need them. She left, and Evelyn stood at the window and watched the wagon go. And behind her Nathaniel said, She's right about going into town. I know, Evelyn said, when you're ready. I'm ready now, she said. She turned around. I'm not going to wait for him to finish building whatever he's building. The best thing I can do is walk into that town and be exactly who I am and let people draw their own conclusions. He looked at her for a moment. Tomorrow, he said. Tomorrow, she agreed. They went the next morning, the three of them, Nathaniel driving, Evelyn beside him with Clara wrapped against her chest in the length of flannel she'd fashioned into a carrier, the baby's dark head tucked under her chin. Tom Bright had been told and had said without looking up from the harness he was mending. Good. About time. Harker's Creek on a Wednesday morning was as busy as it got wagons outside the feed store, women on the sidewalk, the blacksmith shop sending its particular sound out across the main street. Evelyn stepped down from the wagon and adjusted Clara's wrapping, and straightened her back, and walked into Mrs. Aldrich's store like a woman who had every right to be there, which she did, and had always did, and was finished pretending otherwise. Mrs. Aldrich was behind her counter. She looked up when they came in and gave a nod that contained for her a considerable amount of warmth. Two of the auxiliary women were there, Louise Crane and Dottie Ferris, who turned when the door opened and looked at Evelyn and Clara with the frank, immediate interest of women who had been told a story and were now being offered the actual version. It was Dottie Ferris who moved first. She was a round, energetic woman of about 60, with the direct manner of someone who had raised a large number of children and had long since stopped having time for unnecessary formality. She came across the store and looked at Clara with bright, unsentimental eyes and said, Well. Look at her, how old? 3 weeks tomorrow, Evelyn said. She's a good size. Dottie looked at Evelyn. You doing all right? First weeks are the hardest. I'm managing, Evelyn said. You need anything, you ask. I've got children's clothes going back 20 years. No reason for them to sit in a trunk. She said it the way practical women said things that were also kind without flourish, as though the kindness was simply the logical response to the situation. Then she went back to what she'd been doing, and Louise Crane gave Evelyn a small, careful smile, and that was it. No speech, no ceremony, no dramatic turning of community opinion. Just two women in a store deciding, in the quiet way women decided things, that the account they'd been given by someone they trusted for 20 years was more reliable than the account offered by a stranger who smelled like tobacco and calculation. Nathaniel was at the counter with his supply list, talking to Mrs. Aldrich in the easy shorthand of people who'd done business together for years. Evelyn moved around the store with Clara against her chest and let herself be seen, and the morning went the way mornings went ordinarily, practically, unremarkably, and that ordinariness was the most powerful thing that could have happened. Caleb Whitmore was not in town that day. He came the following morning, and he came to the ranch, and this time he came alone. Evelyn was in the garden. She heard the horse, and she stood up and turned around and looked at him without surprise, because she had known he would come once more. Had known it with the certainty she'd developed over the last weeks for reading the specific patterns of his behavior. He needed a final scene. He needed to feel that he had chosen to end it rather than had it ended for him. She let him have the approach. She waited. He dismounted and tied the horse and walked toward her, and he looked, for the first time since Red Willow, like a man who had not entirely held himself together. He had the slight dishevelment of someone who hadn't slept well, and his prepared expression had replaced by something rawer and less managed. "Where's Calloway?" he said. "On the range," she said. "It's a working ranch." He looked at her. He looked at Clara, asleep in the basket in the shade near the garden. She'd started bringing her out in the mornings, the baby seeming to find the outdoor air and the sounds of the ranch settling rather than agitating. His face did something complicated when he looked at Clara. She watched him do it, and she did not help him with it. He started. "She looks like herself," Evelyn said. "She's 3 weeks old. She looks like a person who is new to the world." He looked away from the basket. He looked at Evelyn. And she saw it then, The thing underneath the calculation and the preparation, and the lawyer and the campaign in the dry goods store, she saw the actual, unimpressive truth of him, which was that he was a man who had been afraid. Not of her, not of the baby. Afraid of what it would cost him, the money, the inconvenience, the constraint, and he had made a decision in that fear that he had expected to be consequence-free, the way men like him usually expected their decisions to be consequence-free. And it had not been, and he did not know what to do with that. She had built a story of him in her head, of his cruelty, his coldness, the deliberate malice of a man who had planned to leave her. But standing here looking at his unmade face, she understood that the truth was smaller and more ordinary than cruelty. He had just been afraid and selfish and weak, and those things had done damage as real as any planned cruelty, and they were also just human. Pitifully, unimpressively human. "I'm not coming back after this," he said. It came out with more difficulty than he'd intended. She could hear it. "I want you to know that." "All right," she said. He stopped. "Started again. I made a bad decision. In Red Willow." "Yes," she said. "You did." "I'm not." He pressed his lips together. "I'm not going to pretend it was anything else." She looked at him steadily. "What are you asking for, Caleb?" "Not what the lawyer asked for." "What are you actually asking for?" A long silence. "I don't know," he said finally, and it was the most honest thing she'd ever heard him say. She took a breath. She thought about what it had cost her, the platform, the fear, the 35 days of rebuilding from nothing, the night of Clara's birth in Nathaniel's hand, and the small, furious cry of a new life entering the world. She thought about all of it, the full weight of it, and she thought about what she wanted to carry forward and what she wanted to set down. "I'm not going to tell you that what you did was all right," she said. "It wasn't. You know it wasn't. And Clara is going to grow up knowing who her father is, and I can't control what she does with that knowledge when she's old enough to have it. That's her right." She held his gaze. "But I'm not going to spend the rest of my life making you the villain in a story I'm trying to move away from. I've got better things to do with my time." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in him settled. She could see it, the tension of a man who'd been braced for a fight he hadn't been able to win and had just been told the fight was over. "She's going to be all right," he said. He wasn't asking. "She's going to be more than all right," Evelyn said. He nodded once. He went to his horse and he untied it and he mounted, and he looked at her one last time from the saddle. And she saw in his face the specific expression of a man recognizing something he had let go of and understanding, fully and finally, that it was gone. He rode east. She stood in the garden and watched until she couldn't hear the hoofbeats anymore, and then she turned around and went to the basket and looked at Clara, who was still asleep, her small fist curled beside her cheek, entirely unconcerned with the drama that had just concluded 3 feet away. "Your father came to say goodbye," Evelyn said quietly. He wasn't quite brave enough to say the word, but he came. She touched the back of her daughter's fist with one finger, the same way Nathaniel had that first night. "That's something. It's not everything, but it's something." Clara slept. Nathaniel came in from the range at midday, and she told him, straightforwardly, and he listened without interruption, and then said, "You're all right with it?" "I'm all right with it," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, reading her the careful attention he'd always brought to understanding what was true rather than what was presented. "Good," he said, and went to wash up, and that was the end of it. James Calloway arrived in June. He came on the afternoon stage to Harker's Creek, and Nathaniel drove out to collect him, and Evelyn stayed at the ranch because she thought the first hour should belong to the two of them, father and son, 8 months apart. The particular recalibration that was required every time they came back together after time away. She understood that dynamic without needing it explained. She'd had her own version of it with Margaret, the way you had to find each other again after distance. She heard the wagon in the yard before she heard voices, and she checked the bread it was ready. She'd timed it deliberately, and she untied her apron, and she did not perform anything. She just stood in the kitchen and waited. The door opened and Nathaniel came in first, and behind him, taller than she'd pictured, darker than she'd pictured, with his father's jaw and something in his eyes that was quick and warm and 15 in the best sense of 15. Still open to things, not yet closed down by the world, came James. He saw her and he stopped. She looked at him. "Miss Marlowe," he said. He had clearly been coached on the name, but the wariness was his own, not hostile, just careful. The wariness of a boy who had thought about this meeting and wasn't sure what to expect from it. "James," she said, "I've been looking forward to meeting you." He looked at her with the assessing directness of someone who had grown up in a house with a man who did not pretend and had therefore never learned to pretend either. He looked at her the way Nathaniel looked at things, taking stock, forming a judgment he'd stand by. Then his eyes went past her and found the basket in the corner of the kitchen and Clara in it, awake and working on a particularly focused frown that she'd been developing all morning. "That's her," he said. "That's Clara," Evelyn said. He crossed the kitchen without asking permission in the direct, unstoppable way of a boy who was interested in something and crouched down by the basket and looked at Clara. Clara looked back at him with the thoughtful, slightly skeptical attention she brought to all new faces. "She's looking at me," he said. "She looks at everything," Evelyn said. "She has opinions about most of it." Something crossed his face, the flicker of a grin that was so clearly his father's. She felt it somewhere in her chest. "Dad said that," he said, in his letter, that she already had opinions. "He's right," she said. He stayed crouched by the basket for another moment, and then he stood up and looked at her again, and the wariness had shifted, not gone, but rearranged, sitting alongside something else now, something more curious and more open. "He also said you make good bread," he said. "I do," she said. "Better than Tom's, which ain't hard," he said, "and better than Dad's, which is basically impossible not to be." Nathaniel, from the doorway, said, "I can hear you." "I know," James said, with the easy comfort of a boy who'd been saying things his father could hear his entire life and had made his peace with it. Evelyn set the bread on the table and called them both to sit down, and the three of them and Clara in her basket in the corner, offering occasional commentary, had dinner. And it was loud and ordinary, and alive in a way the kitchen had never quite been in the months she'd been here, and she thought, this is what a house sounds like when it has all its people in it. The thought arrived so naturally, so cleanly, that she didn't even flinch from it. All its people. She was one of them. The summer moved the way Colorado summers moved, fast and bright and demanding, the ranch at its most alive, the range work heaviest, the days longest. James worked alongside Tom and Nathaniel with a commitment that surprised Evelyn until she realized it shouldn't have. He'd been coming out here every summer for years. This was his work too, his place too, and he was 15 and wanted to prove it. He was also, it turned out, intensely curious about everything and not shy about acting on it. He sat at the kitchen table in the evenings while Evelyn nursed Clara and asked her about Philadelphia, what it looked like, what the buildings were like. How many people? Was it true you could walk for an hour and never leave the city? He asked her about sewing, how she'd learned, what the hardest thing to repair was, whether she'd ever made something from nothing or only fixed what was already there. He asked her about her grandmother's farm, and she told him about Wayne County in summer, and he said he'd never been to Ohio, and she said it was a different kind of beautiful from Colorado, quieter, rounder. And he considered this with his father's exact expression of a person genuinely taking in new information. One evening, about 3 weeks into his visit, he asked her directly, "Are you going to stay?" She looked at him. He was looking at Clara, not at her, but the question had been aimed at her. "I'm planning to," she said. "For good," James Nathaniel said from across the room. "It's a fair question," Evelyn said. She looked at the boy. "I'm planning to stay for good." "Yes," he nodded. He still wasn't looking at her. "Dad's different," he said. "Since your letters. I could tell in the letters before I even came." "Different how?" she said. Now he looked at her, the quickened, open 15-year-old eyes. "Like someone turned a light back on," he said simply. The kitchen was quiet. Nathaniel had gone very still in his chair. He was a good father," James said, with the careful fairness of someone who wanted to be accurate. "He was always there when I came. He always wrote. But there was always something I don't know. Like part of him was somewhere else. Like part of him was still in 1873 and couldn't get back. He paused. He doesn't feel like that anymore. Evelyn looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel was looking at his son with an expression that had abandoned all its usual careful management. It was just open, just present. The face of a man who was being seen clearly by the person whose seeing mattered most. James, Nathaniel said after a moment. Sir, thank you for saying that. James looked slightly surprised to be thanked for it, as though he'd said an obvious thing, and couldn't imagine why it required acknowledgement. Which meant he was 15 and didn't yet understand how rare it was to say the true thing plainly, and Evelyn hoped the world took its time teaching him otherwise. The night before James left to go back to Denver, he found Evelyn on the porch after Clara's last feeding, the baby drowsy on her shoulder, the Colorado night enormous overhead. He sat on the step below her and was quiet for a moment, in the comfortable way he'd developed over the summer, the way of someone learning that quiet didn't have to be filled. When Dad comes to Denver at Christmas, he said, "Will you come? You and Clara." She looked at him. "Would you want that?" He shrugged, which was 15 for yes, I would want that, but I'm not going to make a big thing of it. It'd be good for Clara to see Denver, he said, and my aunt would want to meet you. She's been writing me letters asking questions. What kind of questions? Whether you're good for him, he said, without embarrassment. Just plainly. She thought about this. What have you told her? I told her you make good bread and you don't let him get away with being difficult, and you have opinions about tomato plants. He paused. And that you're good for him. Obviously. She looked out at the dark valley below the ranch. Obviously, she said. He went back to Denver in the morning, and Nathaniel came back from the stage in Harker's Creek quieter than usual, the particular quiet of a man who'd just said goodbye to his son and was carrying the weight of the distance between them. She put dinner on the table and they ate without much conversation, and after, when the dishes were done and Clara was asleep, she said, "He asked if we'd come to Denver at Christmas." Nathaniel looked up. "He asked you?" "On the porch last night." He was quiet for a moment, thinking, "Do you want to?" "Yes," she said. He nodded slowly. "Then we'll go." He said it the way he said things he'd decided simply completely, with no qualification underneath. She looked at him across the table. "There's something I want to ask you," she said. "Ask it." She had been thinking about how to say this for 3 weeks, maybe longer, and she had not found a beautiful way to say it and had decided that a beautiful way was not what was required. What was required was the true way, the small and precise way, the way that held. "I want to know," she said, "if you would want to make this formal." Legal. She held his gaze, not because I think I need the protection of it, and not because I'm afraid of what people say. But because I think, she paused, finding it, I think Clara should grow up in a house where the people in it have said plainly what they are to each other. Where nothing is left ambiguous or provisional. She looked at her hands for a moment and then back at him. And because I want to, genuinely, not because I'm grateful or because it's practical. Because I want to. The kitchen was very still. Nathaniel looked at her for a long time. He had the expression she'd come to love most on his face, the one where he was thinking something through to its true bottom before he spoke, because he didn't say things he didn't mean, and he didn't mean things he hadn't tested first. "I've been thinking about how to ask you that same question," he said, "since about the 3rd week you were here." She stared at him. "The 3rd week? You fixed Ellen's curtains," he said. "And you looked away while I touched them, because you understood that it was a private moment." He held her gaze. There are not many people who would have understood that. She thought about it, the spare room, the curtains, the lamplight, 3 weeks in, and the way she'd looked at the wall to give him his moment. She hadn't thought about that in months. "You decided something about me from that," she said. "I understood something about you," he said. "There's a difference." She looked at him. "Then yes," she said, "I'd like to make it formal." "If you would." "I would," he said, "completely." She pressed her lips together against the thing that was rising in her chest, not sadness, something else, something that needed a minute to organize itself into a feeling she could sit with. She breathed through it. He waited, the way he always waited, without filling the silence. "I never thought," she said finally, "when I was sitting on that platform, that the answer to that day was going to be something like this." "What did you think it was going to be?" "Survival," she said. "I thought if I could just survive it, that would be enough." He looked at her across the table, with the full, unguarded expression she'd been collecting all these months, like the most valuable thing she'd ever found. "Is it enough?" he said now. She thought about Clara asleep in the next room. She thought about James on the porch, saying like someone turned a light back on, with his 15-year-old plainness and his father's jaw. She thought about Mrs. Aldrich and her hands flat on the table, and Tom Bright eating bread without commenting, and the curtains in the front room, repaired and hanging, the seams nearly invisible if you didn't know what to look for. She thought about $41 and a broken suitcase, and a man who had walked away and left her with nothing except everything she actually needed to build something real. "No," she said, "it's not enough." She looked at him steadily, with her mother's eyes, with her grandmother's hands, with everything she had brought across the country, and through the worst day, and into this kitchen. "It's more than enough. It's everything." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and she turned her hand over and held his, and neither of them said anything more, because nothing more needed to be said. Outside, the Colorado night went on being enormous and full of stars, and the ranch breathed in the dark around them, the barn, the fences, the creek at the bottom of the valley, the 50 acres that had been one man's solitude and was now quietly and irreversibly, and finally something else entirely. They were married in September in the front room of the Callaway Ranch, with Mrs. Aldrich and Tom Bright and a judge who drove out from Harker's Creek and stood between the two chairs by the window, Ellen's curtains hanging behind them, faded blue and white, repaired so carefully that a person who hadn't known what to look for would never have seen where they'd been broken. James came back from Denver for it. He stood beside his father in his best clothes, and he held Clara through the whole ceremony because she'd reached for him when he came in, and he'd taken her, and she'd settled immediately against his shoulder, and nobody thought it made sense to interfere with that. When the judge finished and Nathaniel put the ring on Evelyn's finger, a plain gold band, nothing elaborate, "The right thing," James said, quietly and to no one in particular good. "About time," which was so exactly what Tom Bright had said 7 months ago, about a different thing, that Evelyn laughed. Full and genuine and unguarded, in a room full of people who were hers, in a house that was hers, in a life she had built from nothing by refusing, even on the worst day, to let go of herself. Clara, on James's shoulder, looked at her mother's laugh with the grave, considering expression she brought to all of Evelyn's emotions, and then she smiled, the first real, full, unambiguous smile she'd ever produced. 4.5 months into the world, and the room went a little undone with it, because that was what that smile did. And Nathaniel Callaway, who had been alone for 11 years and had stopped a wagon at a platform in Red Willow on a hot afternoon in July for reasons he couldn't entirely have articulated, put his hand against his wife's face and looked at her with everything he was, and she looked back with everything she was, and neither of them looked away. The woman who had been called too old and too heavy and too much trouble, who had been left in the dust with nothing, and had turned nothing into this room, this family, this life, stood in the light of her own home and knew, with the absolute and unshakable certainty of someone who had tested the ground and found it solid all the way down, that she had never been too much. She had always been exactly enough. She had always been coming here.